My name is Margaret, and I'm 75 years old. I've never really been the sentimental type, but something about Olivia's 30th birthday made me want to do something different, something personal. I wanted her to have a gift that wasn't just expensive or fashionable, but something that meant something that carried a story. I spent weeks knitting a pair of little bears, one in a tiny blue suit and the other in a cream-coloured dress with lace trim. I stitched every inch myself carefully and slowly, my fingers aching most nights, but my heart full. It had been years since I'd done any serious knitting, but I remembered how it used to calm me when my husband Henry was still alive. Inside the female bear, just beneath the stitching on her chest, I tucked a small blue velvet pouch that held a sapphire. It wasn't just any sapphire. It was the stone Henry gave me for our 40th anniversary. He had it set in a delicate silver pendant and said it reminded him of my eyes when I was young. I hadn't worn it in years. It felt right to pass it on to Olivia. I imagined her discovering it later, perhaps, while moving things around, and realizing that her grandmother had hidden a treasure for her, a quiet message of love and legacy. The thought of her surprise warmed me. As the day of the party approached, I wrapped the gift in gold paper with tiny white stars. I even tied it with a velvet ribbon I found at the craft store, the same kind Olivia had helped me pick out when she was 12. Back then, she loved handmade things, and we'd spend hours painting picture frames and baking cookies shaped like hearts. It was those memories that made me believe she would understand this gift. I knew it wasn't from a registry or a luxury boutique, but I hoped it would stand out in a different way. I thought maybe it would remind her of who we were before life got too busy, before all the glitter and noise. I practiced what I would say when I handed it to her. Just something simple. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I wanted to sound cheerful, not nervous, even though I was. Part of me worried it wouldn't be enough, but the larger part believed she would see what was inside it, not just the sapphire, but the years of love sewn between each stitch. That morning, I spent extra time getting ready. I wore the scarf she bought me 3 Christmases ago, a soft lavender cashmere I still keep in its original box. I even wore a dab of the perfume Henry used to love, just to feel close to him. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. I was proud of the gift, proud of the thought that went into it. As I walked out the door, I held the little box like it was something fragile and precious. Not because of the stone inside, but because of what it represented. A bridge between generations, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things don't come with a price tag. The car ride into the city was quiet. I stared out the window, replaying old memories of Olivia when she was a girl with scraped knees and glitter glue on her fingers. I kept thinking how fast time moves. 1 minute you're holding their hand as they learn to walk, and the next, they're walking into rooms you barely recognize, filled with people who barely remember you. But I didn't let those thoughts sink too deep. Today was about joy, about celebration. I was just the grandmother bringing a gift from the heart, hoping it would matter in a way no store-bought item ever could. That was enough for me. At least I thought it would be. Olivia's apartment was the kind of place you see in magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows, glossy marble floors, soft lighting that made everything and everyone look airbrushed. There were waiters in black shirts offering champagne, a string quartet playing something classical in the corner, and clusters of well-dressed guests laughing over cocktails I couldn't name. I clutched the gift in both hands, a small box wrapped with care that felt completely out of place in that sea of sleek metallic ribbons and gift bags from stores I'd never stepped foot in. A young man at the door took my coat, but didn't offer a smile. For a moment I stood frozen in the entryway, unsure where to go. Victoria, my daughter, waved from across the room, but didn't come over. She just nodded toward the far end of the penthouse, where Olivia stood surrounded by friends. I made my way slowly, careful not to bump into the tray of oysters or the towering cake shaped like a garden of roses. Everything was perfect, pristine, curated. I felt like I was tracking in dirt. Olivia looked beautiful. Her dress was fitted and flawless, her hair pinned up like a movie star's, her diamond earrings sparkling like frost. She was laughing at something her fiancé Ryan had just whispered in her ear. When she saw me, her smile wavered slightly before reforming into a polite version of itself. She didn't hug me. I handed her the box, smiling the way I'd practiced. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Her fingers barely touched mine as she took the gift, holding it as if it were fragile or sticky. People around us grew quiet, expecting the reveal. I felt my heart beat harder as she peeled back the paper. Inside were the two bears tucked together just as I'd placed them. Olivia lifted them with two fingers, holding them up like they might smell bad. Her voice rang out loud and clear. "This looks so cheap." Her words hung in the air like smoke. A beat later, someone chuckled. Then the laughter spread like a spill. Polite at first, then bold. Ryan grinned. "Perfect for goodwill," he said under his breath, but not low enough. Victoria laughed in that tight, uncomfortable way she always did when trying to smooth over something awkward. My son-in-law added something about handmade being sweet for preschoolers. I couldn't feel my legs. My face burned. I tried to speak, to say something about the sapphire hidden inside, but the words caught in my throat. My mouth moved, but nothing came out. The room spun slightly. I could hear the quartet still playing in the distance, oblivious. I looked around, hoping to find one kind face. That's when I saw Ethan standing off to the side with his camera. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me with a quiet apology in his eyes. That small recognition nearly shattered me. I wanted to leave right then, but I couldn't move. I stood there frozen with everyone's laughter swirling around me like wind. I'd spent hours knitting those bears' days, choosing the yarn months, deciding whether to let go of the sapphire. None of that mattered here. Someone offered Olivia another glass of champagne. She set the box aside on a table, not even bothering to close it. The bears slumped together, forgotten. They looked out of place in the gold and crystal world that didn't have room for something soft. Eventually, I found my way to the coat closet. No one stopped me. I don't think anyone even noticed I was gone. Outside, the night was cold and clear. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure where I was or how I felt. I had come to give a gift. I had left with something taken from me. On the ride home, I stared at my hands. The same hands that once braided Olivia's hair, wiped her tears, and taught her to tie her shoes. I wondered when they became invisible, when I became someone to tolerate, to humor, to mock. That night, I sat in my chair by the window and listened to the city breathe. My chest ached, not from age, but from something deeper. I wasn't angry yet, just hollowed out. The kind of emptiness that makes you question what you mean to people who once called you their everything. 2 days after the party, I opened my email and saw the subject line from Victoria Wedding Venue Renovation Docs. Urgent. At first, I thought it must have been a mistake. But as I scrolled through the attachments, the message became painfully clear. Blueprints, contracts, estimates from a designer I'd never heard of, and a short note from my daughter asking me to sign off as soon as possible. She called the house ideal for a modern coastal ceremony. The email praised its location and charm, but referred to the furniture as dated and the interior as in need of upgrades. No mention of the fact that the house had been in our family for over 30 years, that I'd scattered Henry's ashes beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, that it was still mine. At the bottom of the message, she added a personal note. She and Ryan had toured a new senior community near Santa Monica, something more suited to my needs. She included a brochure circled a one-bedroom unit and said they'd already spoken to the admissions director on my behalf. I reread the email 3 times. Each pass left me a little colder. This wasn't about the house anymore. It was about clearing space, making room, shuffling me to the side while they moved forward with their plans. They weren't asking me. They were telling me. It was all laid out so neatly as if my life could be reorganized with a few clicks and an e-signature. They wanted my blessing, my silence, my signature on the dotted line. And in return, I would be offered a stylish apartment with group activities and curated meals, as if that could replace the view of the sea or the memories carved into every corner of that house. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop in front of me, unable to look at the screen any longer. It felt like betrayal in PDF form. I wasn't just being asked to give up a house. I was being pushed out of a space where I still lived, still breathed, still mattered. They wanted the house, and maybe deep down they wanted me out of the way too. The moment I stepped into the Santa Barbara house, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled different, like fresh paint and lavender cleaner, not salt and cedar the way it used to. The furniture had been moved or removed entirely, and the rug Henry picked out for our anniversary was rolled up in the corner like forgotten luggage. In the living room, the walls were bare. The painting of the cove that once hung above the fireplace was gone, replaced with a foam board display covered in fabric swatches, floral photos, and a title at the top that read Seaside Elegance. Beside it sat a binder labelled with Olivia and Ryan's names, as if they already lived there. I walked quietly through the kitchen. The counter was covered in tile samples and a list of appliances to be replaced. My hands brushed the edge of the butcher block island where Henry and I used to drink our morning coffee. The bar stools were gone, and the smell of lemon oil had been scrubbed away. I heard voices coming from the back room. I paused in the hallway, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to help myself. Victoria was speaking to a woman with a clipboard. Her voice was confident, almost breezy, as she gestured toward the back wall. "That's where we'll set up the photo backdrop," she said. "And this area will be open once the built-ins are gone." Then the sentence that froze me. She won't be here much longer anyway. The architect didn't respond, just nodded and jotted something down. I stood there still, the words hanging in the air like smoke from a match. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I simply turned and walked back through the house, my steps silent on the newly polished floor. They were planning a future without me, not in theory, but in blueprint. Every trace of my life was being erased, replaced by muted tones and Pinterest dreams. And they hadn't even bothered to wait until I was gone. I called Harold the next morning. He had been Henry's attorney for nearly 40 years and had helped us with everything from estate planning to the purchase of the Santa Barbara house. I hadn't spoken to him since Henry passed, but when I told him I needed to talk, he cleared his schedule. We met at a quiet cafe near his office. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were sharp as ever. I slid the email from Victoria across the table and waited while he read in silence. He tapped the table twice before speaking. "There's more to this than a wedding," he said. He leaned in and asked if I'd noticed any changes in Victoria's spending. I told him I'd heard rumours about financial strain, but never imagined it was serious. Harold pulled out a folder and laid down a few documents: property tax delays, a second mortgage, some court filings from a business venture that had quietly folded. He explained how trusts could be used to shift ownership without a formal sale, and how a power of attorney, if granted, could strip me of decision-making completely. It was a lot to take in, but something inside me stayed calm. Maybe because the shock had passed. Maybe because I already knew deep down that I wasn't imagining things. Harold looked at me carefully and said that if I wanted to keep control of my assets, I needed to act soon. That word, assets, made me bristle. I didn't think of my home or savings that way, but I realized they did. To Victoria and Ryan, my house wasn't a legacy. It was leverage, a means to an end. As Harold continued explaining options, I found my thoughts drifting back to the house, not the floor plan or the furniture, but the little things. The way sunlight poured through the kitchen window in the morning, the sound of waves beyond the porch. Henry's laugh echoed from the hallway. Those weren't financial holdings. They were my life. By the end of the meeting, I felt something shift. Not anger, not fear, clarity. I saw now that the house wasn't just a place. It was the last space in this world that was still truly mine, and I wasn't going to give it up quietly. The next morning, I walked into my bank branch and asked to speak with a manager. I told her about strange login attempts I had noticed on my online account and requested that all access be restricted to in-person verification only. She nodded without much expression, but the look in her eyes told me she understood exactly what I wasn't saying out loud. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. My hands didn't shake. I typed in the name of a discreet real estate agency Henry and I had once considered years ago when we thought about downsizing. I scheduled a consultation and didn't tell a soul. That weekend, I drove out to the house in Santa Barbara by myself. No one knew I was coming, which gave me time to walk through the rooms without interruption. I touched the hallway walls where Olivia's childhood drawings had once hung. I stood on the back deck and watched the tide roll in, just as Henry and I used to on quiet Sunday mornings. The house was beautiful, still solid, still peaceful. But now every corner echoed with plans that weren't mine. Someone else's flowers, someone else's dress rehearsal, and someone else's version of my life being repurposed without my say. I didn't cry. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was clarity, the kind that settles into your bones when you finally stop apologizing for existing. That house had been my haven for decades, but it had become something else now, a battlefield. They wanted it for a wedding. I would sell it before the vows were ever exchanged, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because I had realized finally that protecting my peace was worth more than preserving their illusion. This time, the decision would be mine, and mine alone. The news broke on a Thursday afternoon. Olivia called me in a full panic, her voice cracking before I could even say hello. She'd just heard from a florist that the wedding venue had been pulled from their schedule because the property was under contract. I could hear Victoria yelling in the background, followed by Ryan's voice, sharp and demanding. Within the hour, the three of them were on my doorstep. Olivia didn't knock. She pushed the door open and marched in like she still believed the house belonged to her. Victoria followed, flushed and furious, clutching a folder of vendor agreements. Ryan came in last hands in his pockets, trying to act calm, but clearly fuming. They didn't ask questions. They threw accusations. How could I do this without telling anyone? How dare I ruin Olivia's wedding plans after everything they'd done for me? I let them rant. When they finally paused to breathe, I spoke. I told them the house was mine, that I had never agreed to hand over control, that their plans had been made without my consent, and I was simply correcting a mistake they refused to acknowledge. Victoria's voice rose again, louder this time. She accused me of being petty, irrational, and cruel. Olivia sobbed into her hands, saying this was going to destroy everything. Ryan stepped forward, lowering his voice, trying to sound reasonable, as he warned me this decision would tear the family apart. I looked at each of them in turn, and I said the words I'd been holding for weeks. I am not an asset. I am not a placeholder. I am not something you move around when it's convenient. You don't get to decide my value, and you don't get to write my ending. You assumed I would give you whatever you wanted just because I always have. But that ends now. They stood there, stunned. For the first time, they had no response, no arguments, no defense. I walked them to the door without another word. I closed it gently behind them. And for the first time in a long while, I felt taller. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped shrinking to make them comfortable. They called it a family meeting, but I knew what it really was the moment I walked through Victoria's front door. The living room had been staged like a courtroom, with my doctor seated awkwardly in the corner, a lawyer in a stiff grey suit beside him, and a manila envelope resting on the coffee table. Victoria greeted me with that smile she saves for uncomfortable charity events, the kind that hides something sharp underneath. Olivia sat quietly, her eyes red but unreadable. Ryan stood with his arms crossed, silent but seething. Ethan was there too, off to the side, watching everything with a kind of stillness I recognized as concern. Victoria launched first. She spoke slowly, using words like stress age and recent instability. The lawyer chimed in about best interests, about protecting long-term health and financial safety. Then came the papers, Power of attorney forms, a draft of a trust, a suggestion that perhaps it was time I allowed someone else to manage things for me. I didn't speak at first. I let the silence stretch until even the doctor looked uncomfortable. Then I opened my bag and pulled out a thin stack of documents. I handed one to the lawyer, one to the doctor, one to Ethan. Bank statements, digital logs of attempted logins from unfamiliar IPs, a copy of the second mortgage taken out in Victoria's name without disclosure, a summary of the failed business venture Ryan had quietly buried, along with the debts it left behind. I asked the doctor if he believed I was of sound mind. He cleared his throat, nodded, and said yes. I turned to the lawyer and said I'd be seeking counsel of my own should any more documents appear without my request. Then I looked at Victoria. You thought I wouldn't notice? That I'd sign whatever you put in front of me because I always have? But you forgot who I was before I became convenient. Ethan stood up, stepped closer to me, and said quietly that I didn't owe anyone in this room an explanation, just my truth. I squeezed his hand in silent thanks. No one had much to say after that. The room, once full of noise and control, had gone still. I picked up my bag, walked to the door, and turned back just long enough to say what I needed to. This isn't betrayal. This is a correction. I'm not handing over my life because it makes yours easier. I've given enough. Now I'm keeping what's mine. Olivia showed up on a grey Sunday afternoon just as the rain started tapping against the windows. I hadn't expected her, but I opened the door anyway. She didn't smile, didn't say hello, just stepped inside with her arms crossed and her shoulders tense like armor. She stood in the middle of the living room, scanning the space like it was foreign territory. I offered her tea, but she shook her head. For a long moment we didn't speak. Then she asked why. Not softly, not gently, just that single word, sharp and direct. I told her the house was never just a venue, that it wasn't about revenge or ruining her day. It was about taking back something I hadn't realized I'd lost until I was nearly erased from my own life. She stared at the floor and asked if I knew how much this had cost her. I nodded. Then I asked if she remembered the bears I gave her. Her expression flickered. She said she didn't keep them. Said they didn't seem like much at the time and she had other gifts to make space for. I told her that inside one of them was a sapphire, the one her grandfather gave me. She looked up, eyes wide. I said it softly. I wanted her to find it later. I thought it would be a surprise, something meaningful. A piece of family she could carry into the next chapter of her life. But she hadn't looked, hadn't thought to. Her face crumpled just slightly. She asked if I was trying to make her feel guilty. I said no. I was trying to help her understand that sometimes value doesn't shout, sometimes it sits quietly waiting to be noticed, but if you dismiss it too quickly, it can disappear before you realize what you've lost. She sat down across from me finally. Her voice was smaller now. She said she didn't know what she was doing anymore. The wedding had become more about performance than commitment, that Ryan had started to feel like a business partner instead of a fiancé. I didn't say I told you so. I just listened. She said she felt like a failure, like she'd missed something important but couldn't name what it was. I told her maybe that something wasn't gone. Maybe it was just buried under too many expectations. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But the silence between us softened. And for the first time in a long while, she looked at me like I was still her grandmother. Not an obstacle, not an inconvenience. Just someone who had tried in the only way she knew how to love her. When she left, she paused at the door and said she was sorry. Not for one thing, but for everything. I nodded and said I'd keep a kettle warm if she ever wanted to talk again. She gave me a small, tired smile before walking out into the rain. And I stood there watching the door, thinking about the little bear with the missing heart, wondering if maybe one day she'd start looking again. And this time, see what was really there. The first night in my new apartment, I left the windows open just enough to hear the ocean. It was a smaller space than the house in Santa Barbara, but it felt larger somehow. Cleaner. Quieter. Not because of square footage, but because it held only what I chose to bring with me. The view was extraordinary. Floor 15 facing west, nothing but sea and sky beyond the glass. At sunset, the light filled every corner of the room in warm gold, as if the day itself was wrapping its arms around me. I stood by the window and breathed it in. Ethan came by a few days later. I gave him an envelope, no ceremony, no speech. Inside was a check to help launch his photography studio, something he'd only dared to dream about. He tried to protest, said it was too much, but I told him it wasn't a gift. It was a belief. In him. In what he could build. He hugged me tighter than I expected. That meant more than any thank you. Since then, my days have been simple. Mornings with coffee and a crossword. Walks along the water. Evenings with books and music. No one calls to ask for money. No one expects me to play host or sign papers I haven't read. I live for myself now, not because I've closed the door on my family, but because I've finally opened the one for me. There are still moments I think about the house. I miss the sound of Henry's footsteps on the old stairs, the way the porch creaked when he sat in his chair. But I don't miss what it became. I don't miss being invisible in my own life. Sometimes Olivia texts, short messages, a photo of a sunset, a book recommendation. Nothing heavy, but enough. Maybe we're starting to rebuild something brick by careful brick. And if we don't, that's all right too. Love, when it's real, doesn't disappear. It just waits. I've learned something in all this. That people will try to define you by what you can give them, what you can provide, and how convenient you are. But your value doesn't belong to them. It never did. And when you finally stop asking them to see it, that's when you begin to feel it yourself. I'm not lost. I'm not broken. I'm not someone's leftover chapter. I'm still writing, still standing, and finally free.